It was a warm summer evening in 2006 when 12-year-old Hannah Royce clipped the leash onto her golden retriever, Daisy, and walked down the dirt path behind her family's rural home. She never came back. For 17 years, no sign of her or the dog was ever found until now. When Daisy's collar is discovered beneath a rotting floorboard in a crumbling farmhouse, miles from where she vanished, Hannah's parents are forced to reopen wounds they've spent years trying to close. But what the investigators uncover next will not only rewrite the history of Hannah's disappearance, it will expose secrets that some people have killed to keep buried. The sun dipped low behind the tree line, bleeding amber and gold, through the thick summer air that clung to everything in the quiet town of Millhaven, Missouri. 12-year-old Hannah Royce clipped the leash onto Daisy's collar, the retriever's tail wagging furiously, as if she knew this twilight walk was something special. "Don't go too far," Marla called from the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Just around the loop, all right?" Hannah gave a quick nod, already halfway down the gravel path that wound through the trees behind their property. Daisy trotted beside her, tongue lolling, ears perked. It was the kind of evening that made you forget the world could ever be cruel. Marla watched until the two disappeared past the bend where the brush thickened. Fireflies blinked lazily above the tall grass, and the faint hum of cicadas filled the air like static. She turned back into the house, heading for the kitchen to finish the mashed potatoes before Greg got home. The screen door creaked, then clapped shut behind her. 15 minutes passed, then 20. From the open kitchen window, Marla heard a sharp bark, Daisy's bark. Not the playful kind, not the "come chase me" yip that echoed across fields most evenings. This one was sharp, distressed. Then came another, and then nothing. Silence settled like a stone. Marla's hands stopped moving, a spoon hovering over the pot. She walked to the window, leaning out, listening. Nothing but the hiss of wind through leaves and the occasional crack of a distant branch. No footsteps, no laughter, no jingling tags. Her stomach tensed. She wiped her hands again too hard this time, smearing gravy onto the towel, and stepped out onto the porch. "Hannah?" she called, voice pitching a little higher. No answer, only the deepening shadows. She tried again. "Hannah! Daisy!" Still nothing. The quiet became unbearable. Grabbing a flashlight and slipping on Greg's old boots, Marla took the path herself, heart pounding harder with every step. The beam of the flashlight jittered over the path as her hand shook. She walked fast, calling her daughter's name, then the dog's, then both together as panic tightened around her lungs. And then she saw it. Daisy's leash, coiled neatly like a ribbon on the ground, the metal clasp still closed. No dirt, no signs of a struggle, just lying there, clean and deliberate, in the middle of the path. And beside it, nothing. No dog. No Hannah. Not even a footprint. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the quiet woods behind the Royce property were no longer silent. The whir of drones, the thud of boots against damp underbrush, and the static crackled voices of deputies on radios filled the air that once only held bird song. Yellow tape flapped against trees like a cruel imitation of celebration streamers. Marla stood at the edge of the trail, her arms crossed tightly around her body, as if holding herself together was the only thing she could do. Her lips were chapped from the night air and the way she'd chewed them raw while pacing through the darkest hours. She hadn't slept, she hadn't eaten, she couldn't. Greg was somewhere deeper in the woods, shouting Hannah's name again and again until his voice gave out and came back as a rasp. Volunteers had come in droves, neighbors, strangers, people from churches and schools and local scout troops forming human chains, combing every square inch of brush and briar. Men carried thermal cameras and walked shoulder to shoulder, calling out both names, "Hannah, Daisy." The name of the dog felt strange to some, but it was included in every call. Everyone held on to the same hope. The dog would come out of the woods, and the girl wouldn't be far behind. But nothing came out. The first real clue, or the only clue, was the leash. Deputy Collins had picked it up at dawn after marking its position and photographing it from every angle. He turned it over in his hands like it might confess something. It hadn't been torn or broken. The clasp wasn't damaged. It had been cleanly unclipped, left behind on the gravel path as if the dog had been set free. Or let go. They tried scent dogs, bringing them to the leash like sacred relics. The German shepherd from a neighboring county picked up something for a few yards, then circled and whined, confused. Nothing to follow. No trail. By noon the sheriff himself had arrived, his badge catching the light like an accusation. "She didn't just vanish," he said flatly, scanning the woods like they might spit Hannah back out. "Somebody knows something. People don't disappear like this. Not without help." Marla stared at the empty leash in a plastic evidence bag, now sealed and labeled. It looked so small now, so innocent. Daisy was trained never to run off. Hannah was scared of the dark. None of it made sense. But it was becoming clear that something or someone had taken them both. The boy sat in the metal chair like he'd been there before. Slouched back, arms folded, one scuffed sneaker tapping the linoleum in steady defiance. His name was Tyler Brandt, 17 years old, sharp-jawed with a permanent smirk carved into his face like he'd practiced it in mirrors. Sheriff Conway watched him through the two-way glass, his arms crossed over his chest, jaw tight. "Third time this year we've had him in here," Deputy Rawlins muttered beside him. "Shoplifting, trespassing, that fight at the gas station. He's not a kid anymore, and he's not getting better." Conway didn't respond. He was watching Tyler's eyes, the way they flicked around the room like he was already bored, like he was too cool to be scared. But underneath that swagger, the sheriff could see something else: attention, carefully hidden beneath practiced indifference. Inside the room, Detective Moran dropped a thick file onto the table with theatrical weight. Tyler didn't flinch. "You know why you're here," she said, pulling out a chair across from him. Tyler shrugged. "Some girl goes missing, and you all think I had something to do with it. Figures. Hannah Royce isn't just some girl. She lived 2 blocks from your uncle's place. You've been seen walking that trail behind her house before." "Yeah, because I walk. Like people do. I didn't take anyone. I don't even know her." Moran opened the file, flipping through statements. "A witness says they saw you near the old quarry the night Hannah disappeared, around the same time she would have been walking her dog. That ring any bells?" Tyler's mouth opened, then closed. "I wasn't there." "Where were you?" "At home, watching TV." "Alone?" A pause. "Yeah. So no one can confirm your alibi." Tyler leaned back, eyes narrowing. "You're trying to pin this on me because I'm easy. I screw up sometimes, yeah, but I'm not a damn kidnapper." Moran watched him carefully. "You ever talk to Hannah? Ever see her walking Daisy?" "Look, I saw the dog around, but I never talked to her. Ever." Outside the glass, Conway exhaled slowly. "He's lying," he said. Rawlins nodded. "But about what?" Tyler's hands were steady, his eyes were dry. But when he thought no one was watching, his foot had stopped tapping. It was still now like something in him had locked up. Like he was trying to remember what he did that night. Or forget it. The living room was still, except for the low hum of the refrigerator 2 rooms away and the muffled voices coming from the television reporters dissecting Hannah's disappearance like they were solving a puzzle, not talking about a 12-year-old girl who slept with the hall light on and still asked for a bedtime story on bad days. The screen flickered with aerial shots of the woods, the farmhouse, the leash. Marla sat on the edge of the couch, her spine stiff, hands clutched tight in her lap. Her knuckles were white. "I told them to stop using her school photo," she said softly. "She hated that picture, said it made her nose look crooked." Greg stood behind her, arms folded, staring past the screen as though he could tune it all out if he just looked hard enough. His eyes were red from lack of sleep or maybe from the fight they'd had earlier. It was hard to tell anymore. "It's the only one they have," he muttered. "You threw out the others." "I didn't throw them out. I boxed them. You shoved them in the attic like we weren't supposed to look at her anymore." Greg flinched, the accusation landing harder than it should have. "You think I don't want to see her face?" Marla turned, her eyes blazing through the exhaustion. "I think you want to move on, to pretend she's already gone." "She is gone, Marla." His voice cracked like a snapped branch, loud in the suffocating quiet. It's been 3 weeks. 3. We don't have a trail. We don't have a ransom. We don't even have a damn footprint. She stood now, the weight of his words pushing her forward. So we just give up? No. But I can't sit here every night listening to reporters talk about our daughter like she's a headline. I can't stand one more casserole left on our porch from people who want to feel better about themselves. I can't keep watching you die in pieces every time the phone doesn't ring. She didn't cry. Not anymore. It was like the tears had dried up the moment she saw the leash in that plastic bag. I don't need you to fix this, she whispered. I need you to remember that she's ours, that she's out there, somewhere. Greg didn't answer. He stared at the TV again, where Hannah's picture still smiled in the corner of the screen like she was just another face in the nightly news cycle. It was the same smile she gave him the morning she disappeared. He hadn't said goodbye. He couldn't remember why. The seasons turned like pages in a book no one wanted to finish. Summer burned into autumn, the woods behind the Royce home shedding their green for brittle gold, then bare silence. Winter came hard and early that year, snow clinging to the trees like ash, softening the landscape that had once swallowed a girl whole. The trail where Hannah had walked with Daisy became a place people avoided, no too quiet, too haunted, but Marla still went. She bundled herself in Greg's old flannel and Hannah's scarf and sat on the bench they'd installed at the edge of the trailhead. In loving memory of Hannah Royce, the plaque read, though Marla had argued against that wording. Memory made it sound final, as if she were gone. She wanted the word hope, but the town committee had overruled her. They called it closure. Every morning, Marla brought a thermos of coffee and sat there, sometimes for an hour, sometimes until her legs went numb. She watched the woods breathe. She listened for a bark that never came. The bench became her altar, flowers in spring, a small pumpkin in October. In December, she tied a red ribbon around the armrest, like a gift no one would open. People noticed. The local paper ran a story on the mother who refused to forget. They called her strong, brave, but Marla didn't feel strong. She felt hollow. She clung to the ritual because it gave shape to the ache. Greg, on the other hand, couldn't bear the bench. He didn't go to the trail anymore. He didn't want to see the leash, the woods, the path. He didn't even want to hear Hannah's name. He spent long hours in the garage fixing things that weren't broken oiling tools, organizing nails by size, sanding shelves that would never be hung. He spoke less and drank more. The man who once sang off-key while cooking breakfast now moved through the house like a ghost. They spoke like roommates now. Milk's in the fridge. Did you lock the back door? They shared a bed, but they never reached for each other. At night, Marla would lie still, listening to Greg's breathing, wondering if he dreamed of their daughter or if the weight of grief had already taken her from him too. In the town of Millhaven, life slowly adjusted. New students filled Hannah's seat in school. Her picture remained on the missing persons board at the post office, a little more faded each year. But not to Marla. To her, Hannah wasn't gone. She was just out there waiting, cold maybe, lost maybe, but not forgotten, never that. The farmhouse had been empty for years, maybe decades, its bones sagging under the weight of time and rot. What paint remained on the siding was sun-bleached and flaking, the windows either broken or boarded with planks that hung loose like broken teeth. Ivy strangled the southern wall, and inside, the air smelled of mold, rust, and forgotten things. Perfect, really, for the kind of footage Caleb and Jen were after. They were in their early 20s, thrill chasers with a YouTube channel built on exploring the abandoned and the decaying. Urban archaeology, Jen liked to call it. They carried headlamps, GoPros strapped to their chests, and a duffel of flashlights and water bottles. The house was off a back road just outside Millhaven, surrounded by overgrown cornfields and a rusted-out tractor that looked like it hadn't moved since VHS tapes were still relevant. The front door gave way with a groan and a cloud of dust. Inside, time had collapsed. Wallpaper peeled in long, curling sheets. Mice droppings littered the corners. An old recliner sat in the living room, like someone might still come back for it. A crucifix hung crooked above the fireplace. Jen panned her light across the walls while Caleb filmed. Creepy factor is a solid 9, she whispered. They moved room to room, narrating, joking, occasionally breaking into hushed awe when they found a piece of furniture still intact or a photograph stuck in a drawer. Upstairs, they found a child's bedroom tiny shoes by the closet door, a mobile hanging lopsided from the ceiling, its moons and stars thick with dust. But it was the basement that would change everything. The stairs groaned with every step as Caleb descended, his flashlight beam trembling across concrete walls. The basement was unfinished, damp, filled with broken crates and rusted tools. Jen followed behind, covering her nose. "Smells like mildew and dead hope," she muttered. Then she froze. "Caleb," she said quietly, shining her light into the corner. Something metallic glinted beneath a pile of rags and broken wood. A collar. It was pink once, now dulled by time, with a tarnished brass tag that caught the light. Jen knelt, brushing away the grime with her sleeve. The engraving was still clear. Daisy. She stared at it, blinking. Didn't that girl? The one who went missing? Didn't she have a dog named Daisy? Caleb leaned in, heart starting to race. "Yeah," he said slowly. 17 years ago. Jen looked up, the collar cradled in her palm like a relic from another life. "Then what the hell is it doing here?" Detective Evelyn Brooks stood in the shadow of the farmhouse, her badge clipped to the collar of her windbreaker, a fresh crime scene tape fluttering behind her in the morning breeze. The place reeked of mildew and dust, the kind of forgotten air that clung to your skin and didn't let go. She'd been called out before Sunrizy an anonymous tip from the sheriff's office, something about a dog collar found during a YouTube exploration. She hadn't expected much. Cold cases got tips like this all the time, people chasing ghosts. But the moment she saw the collar, its tag scratched but legible, she knew. Daisy. The dog everyone had stopped talking about, the one who vanished with a girl 17 summers ago. "Secure the perimeter," she said to the uniformed officer at her side. "Nobody goes in or out without gloves and booties. I want this place preserved like a crime scene, not a tourist stop." Inside, the farmhouse felt more like a tomb. Dust motes danced in the slats of light filtering through the boarded windows. Every step creaked. The collar had been marked, photographed, bagged. Now the forensics team moved methodically, scanning, swabbing, cataloging. A K9 unit sniffed the baseboards while a tech swept the basement with an ALS light. The energy was cautious, tense like the air before a storm. That's when they found the fur. Just a few strands, caught in the corner of a rotted wooden step in the basement. Golden, coarse. A match, if the lab confirmed it. And then, 10 minutes later, the blood. It had dried into the grain of the floor beneath a broken cabinet, hidden under years of dirt and dust. One of the techs lifted it with a moistened swab, the cotton tip turning pinkish brown. "Dog or human?" Evelyn asked. "Won't know until we get it back to the lab," came the answer. But they both knew what they hoped and feared it might be. Then came the journal. It was wedged behind a loose panel in the wall, wrapped in a disintegrating plastic bag. The cover was floral, juvenile, the kind you'd find in a back-to-school aisle. Pages stuck together, some torn, but enough remained legible to make Evelyn's skin prickle. The handwriting was small, slanted, nervous. One line had been circled in pen over and over, cutting through the paper. He said not to scream anymore. Evelyn closed the journal slowly, the air around her suddenly too still. The cold case wasn't cold anymore. It was waking up. The journal smelled like mildew and rot when they unwrapped it on the evidence table, but the words inside were sharp enough to cut through years of dust. Detective Brooks sat alone in the quiet of her office, the overhead light humming faintly, a pair of gloves on her hands as she turned each fragile page with the care of someone handling broken glass. The handwriting was uneven, slanted more sharply as the entries went on, the letters pressed harder into the paper until the pen tore the page in places. Whoever had written this had been young, probably no older than 16. The first entries were ordinary lists of chores, little rants about foster parents, Notes about someone named Caleb who smokes too much and stares like he's already dead. But around halfway through, the tone changed. The handwriting grew messy, the thoughts jumbled, like the writer was trying to outrun something terrible by writing faster. One name kept surfacing: the girl with the dog. June 15. She's back again, the girl with the dog. I don't know her name, but the dog's golden and sweet and too clean for this place. I think she's new. He didn't let her out today. I could hear the dog barking all night. I pretended it wasn't real. The entry was followed by a page where the ink had bled from what looked like water damager, maybe tears. June 18. The girl is quiet. She looks like she's trying not to breathe. She's always wearing the same jeans. I think he took her shoes. Her dog stopped barking. I think he made her watch. Brooks swallowed hard, eyes scanning ahead. There were drawings, two stick figures at first, then crude floor plans, and finally a square at the bottom of one page labeled simply, "The Silence Room." June 23. He told me I could stay upstairs if I didn't scream anymore. If I did, I'd go in the silence room like her. He says it helps people learn how to listen, but I heard her crying through the wall. That's not learning, that's breaking. She flipped another page, then another. Some were blank. Others were smeared with ink where the writer had tried to scratch something out, but the pressure from the pen left ghosted indentations on the next sheet. July 2. She hasn't made a sound in 3 days. Maybe that's what he wanted. Or maybe she's not there anymore. Brooks let the journal rest in her lap. The office was cold, but her neck felt hot, like shame rising from beneath the skin. Somewhere in these pages was a map, maybe not to a body but to the truth. And the girl with the dog? She had a name now. Hannah. The house sat at the end of a gravel road, no longer marked on any map, half swallowed by trees and ivy, its mailbox leaning sideways like it had grown tired of being looked for. Detective Brooks parked at the edge of the drive, tires crunching over frost-hardened dirt, and stepped out into the brittle morning. The wind bit at her collar as she approached the porch, its boards weathered to the color of ash. No doorbell. Just a knocker shaped like a pine cone and the distant sound of static coming from a radio inside. She knocked once, twice. No answer. She was about to knock again when the door creaked open a few inches, and an eye appeared in the gap. Pale blue, cloudy, blinking slowly, as if measuring how much to care. "You from the county?" the voice rasped. "No, Millhaven PD," Brooks said. "Detective Evelyn Brooks. I'm looking for Everett Langston." The door opened wider, revealing a man in his late 70s, tall but hunched, wrapped in a corduroy robe and wool socks. His face was lined with sunspots and stubble, and his hands trembled slightly on the doorknob. "You found him?" he said, not sounding impressed. "What's this about?" "I'd like to ask you some questions about the farmhouse down on Wren Hollow Road. You used to live on the adjoining property, correct?" Langston's face twitched, just a flicker. Recognition, annoyance, maybe something else. "Used to. I moved out in 2004. Place was falling apart even then. Your name came up in connection with a recent discovery there, a missing person case from 2006, a girl named Hannah Royce." Langston's lips pressed into a thin line. "I saw that on the news. The collar. Damn dog." "You remember her?" "No, but I remember the search. Dogs barking through the woods for days. Woke me up every morning for a week. I was still here back then, just not at that farmhouse. That place was boarded up. Condemned." Brooks studied him. "You're certain you weren't there in 2006? "I'm certain," he said sharply. "I left before that, moved here to take care of my wife, cancer." His voice cracked slightly, then steadied. "She died in May of '06. I never set foot on that property after we left. Didn't even drive past." "Did you know who lived there after you?" Langston's eyes narrowed. "Far as I know, no one did. That place was dead. But sometimes," he added quieter now, "I thought I saw lights there, late at night, just flashes through the trees. Figured it was squatters, or worse." He paused. You think someone kept that girl there? Brooks didn't answer. She didn't have to. The barn behind the farmhouse was a skeleton, its roof half-caved, and the red paint long bled away by sun and rain. Flakes of rust curled off the hinges as Detective Brooks pushed open the sagging door, the stench of soil and rot drifting out like something exhaled. Inside, the air was damp, heavy, and so still that even the birds in the trees outside had gone quiet. The forensics team was already at work, their equipment humming like distant thunder. A ground-penetrating radar unit was sweeping back and forth across the dirt floor in slow, deliberate arcs, each pass revealing more than the eye ever could. The technician guiding the device, a quiet man named Ellis, watched his monitor with the focus of a surgeon. Behind him, his assistant marked the floor with small red flags each time the screen pulsed in a way that didn't make sense. Brooks crouched near one of the flags, brushing away the loose hay and debris. "How deep?" she asked. 18 to 20 inches, Ellis replied. "And it's not just one area. There's a rectangular outline here. Could be a trench. Something was definitely buried." Brooks stood, rubbing her gloved hands together against the cold. The journal, the one with the drawing shad, included a rough sketch of this barn. She remembered the words scribbled next to it. He said, "The silence stays here." It didn't take long to bring in the excavation team. By mid-afternoon, shovels had broken through the compacted soil. The first layer yielded nothing but roots and broken shards of wood, old nails, and the skeleton of a mouse. But the second layer was different. Denser, touched. "Ma'am," one of the diggers called softly, holding something in his hands. "You'll want to see this." Brooks stepped forward and looked down. A plastic comb, pink with a missing tooth, then a button. Then the corner of a child's notebook, swollen from water damage, but still faintly decorated with glitter stars. They kept digging. That's when they found the bones. Small, fragile, a shallow depression that hadn't disturbed the ground enough to draw attention all those years ago, but had been there, waiting, just beneath the surface. And then, something else. A wooden crate, the size of a footlocker, buried at the base of the trench, sealed with rusted hinges. Inside, swaddled in plastic wrap and mold, were personal items. A cracked Polaroid, a dog tag, strands of long blonde hair still caught in a barrette. Brooks stared at it all, her voice dry and distant when she finally spoke. "Get the coroner, and call Marla Royce." Because they hadn't just found evidence. They had found Hannah's shadow. The freezer had been shoved into a corner of the barn's back room, disguised beneath rotted tarps and a rusted-out filing cabinet that had collapsed in on itself. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Edges sealed shut with layers of dust and grime, the cord long severed and curled like a dead snake behind it. But the lock was new, heavy, clean. Detective Brooks stared at it for a long moment before motioning to the team. "Cut it." When the bolt cutters snapped through the lock, the lid groaned open with a sound like old hinges on a coffin. The air that spilled out was stale and cold, preserved not by ice but by isolation. Inside, instead of food or biological waste, were boxes, neatly stacked, waterproof containers, plastic-wrapped and labeled in blocky handwriting. They were VHS tapes. Dozens of them. Brooks reached for the top box, flipping it open. Inside were tapes arranged in rows, each one marked with a date and, in some cases, a time. No titles, no names. Just silent stamps of chronology, like a ledger of something too important or too damning to label out loud. "What the hell is this?" one of the deputies muttered, leaning in. Brooks didn't answer. She was already sorting through the tapes, her eyes scanning the dates. March 2002, July 2003, December 2004. They ran in sequence, each year represented, some months repeated, some skipped. A few had spidery notations on them. Blue jacket, bad dog, crying stopped, but most were unadorned. Then she saw it. June 17, 2006. Hannah's disappearance date. Brooks felt her stomach turn as she set that tape aside, her fingers suddenly trembling. "Get me a VCR, we're not waiting on this." It took an hour to find one that worked. They rigged a makeshift viewing setup in the farmhouse's front room, using a small portable generator to power the equipment. The image flickered onto the screen, grainy and gray, static dancing at the corners. The camera was pointed at a basement, concrete floors, one bare bulb swinging overhead. At first, it was empty. Then a dog. Golden. Thin. Moving slowly. It sniffed at the corners, tail low, ears back. Daisy. The room held no sound, but the image was enough. A moment later, movement in the corner, small, tentative. A girl's shadow. A figure huddled against the wall, arms wrapped around her knees. Her hair covered her face. Brooks leaned forward, heart thudding. The girl looked up. It was Hannah. Frozen in time. Captured. Stored. Not just missing, documented. Archived. Watched. The room was dim, the only light coming from the flickering television screen and the pale blue cast of dawn leaking in through the blinds. Detective Brooks stood with her arms crossed, jaw clenched, her eyes locked on the image in front of her like it might flinch. Around her, a handful of officers, techs, and analysts watched in silence as the tape labeled 44 clicked into motion. The screen wavered for a moment before stabilizing. The angle was low, the camera set on a tripod in the corner of what looked like a cellar, concrete walls, exposed pipes, damp and unwelcoming. A single bulb swung overhead, casting an uneven glow. Dust floated through the light like ash suspended in water. Daisy appeared first, pacing. Her fur was matted and dull, her ribs faintly visible beneath her coat. She barked a short, frantic sound and stared off toward the darkened stairwell as if waiting for someone who never came. Then, from somewhere beyond the frame, a child's voice called out, "Daisy?" The bark sharpened, as if the dog recognized the voice, tail wagging faintly, moving toward the sound. A shadow appeared at the top of the stairs, and then, slowly, a girl's legs came into view. Bare feet, thin ankles. She descended one step, then paused. The camera didn't zoom, didn't follow whoever had set it up, had left it running, impersonal and fixed. The voice came again, softer this time. "Is it morning?" The girl took another step into the light. Hannah. There was no mistaking her now. Her face was thinner than her school photo, her hair tangled, her eyes hollow. She crouched beside Daisy, whispering into the dog's fur. Brooks could feel the tension in the room rising, everyone leaning forward just slightly, like proximity could protect them from what they knew might come next. Then a door slammed off screen, sharp, final. Hannah flinched, grabbing Daisy by the collar. Her mouth opened, but the sound didn't come through. The tape had no audio, but her fear was unmistakable. The camera trembled. Not much. Just a subtle jolt, like someone had bumped it or touched the tripod. Then it cut. Not to black but to static. White noise. A silent blizzard of nothing. "Rewind it," Brooks said, though no one moved. Her voice was too quiet. "Go back. I want to see the second before it cut." But it was already too late. Whatever had been filmed after that moment was either erased, recorded over, or never meant to be seen. And in that absence, in the grainy silence between bark and static, the questions multiplied. The file was thick, brittle at the corners, and smelled faintly of mildew like everything else pulled from the courthouse basement where old records went to be forgotten. Detective Brooks flipped through the faded paperwork with a growing sense of unease. Names, dates, incident reports, all loosely organized in a manila folder marked Hillview Home for Children. At first glance, it looked like a typical mid-90s foster care placement site. Located 5 miles from the abandoned farmhouse, Hillview had once operated out of a white clapboard house on the edge of the woods, tucked away from the main road. Officially, it shut down in 2001, the year before the first VHS tape had been dated. The owner, Daniel Coyle, had been a former youth pastor. A smiling man in all the black and white ID photos, his arm always slung casually around the shoulders of whatever child was closest. His death certificate listed a heart attack in 2015. buried in a cemetery outside of town with no surviving relatives. But the complaints, those, were still alive. Brooks read them in silence. A string of reports filed between 1998 and 2000. Unexplained bruises, kids refusing to speak, one boy who ran away and was found 2 towns over, barefoot and silent. No charges were ever filed. Each case had been closed with notes like inconclusive or unsubstantiated, signed off by the same social worker who rotated through a dozen overloaded homes. One note, barely legible, read, "Children appear fearful of basement." One child referred to it as the bad room. A chill crept up Brooks's arms. She turned the page and found a hand-drawn map, crude, childlike, recovered during a home visit. It showed the layout of the foster house, with one room at the back circled in red. Inside it, scrawled in block letters, "No screaming." "What the hell were you doing, Daniel?" she murmured. Brooks stood and walked over to the evidence board in the station's war room. She pinned the foster home address just south of the farmhouse and took a step back. The proximity was too tight to be coincidence. Coyle had run his operation less than a 10-minute walk from where Hannah's collar had been found. He was dead, no confession, no trial. But maybe, just maybe, he wasn't working alone. Maybe someone else had inherited the silence. And maybe Hannah had never just vanished, maybe she'd been passed along, moved like furniture from one house of horror to another, while the town looked the other way. The wind tugged at Marla's coat as she stepped out of the car, the door creaking behind her like it didn't want to close. The farmhouse stood in the distance, half eclipsed by a line of blackened trees, its roof slouched and sides blistered from time. Everything about the place seemed to resist memory, like it had tried to forget itself, but Marla remembered. She hadn't wanted to come. Detective Brooks had offered to send photos instead, said it wasn't necessary for her to be here, but Marla had insisted. After 17 years of looking into shadows and waiting by the window for answers that never came, she needed to see it with her own eyes, where the collar had been found, where the tapes had been discovered, where her daughter might have been kept, hidden just beyond the reach of hope. She walked slowly, the frozen grass crunching beneath her boots, eyes scanning the weathered landscape like it might offer a hint, a whisper. There was no sound but the wind and the brittle groan of tree limbs overhead. The barn came into view, partially collapsed now, its roof gaping and skeletal. A yellow evidence marker fluttered near the doorway. Marla paused, her breath catching. She didn't know what she was looking for, she only knew she couldn't not look. Her feet carried her to the edge of the barn, past a cluster of trees that seemed familiar in a way she couldn't explain. And then she saw it. The well. A low stone circle, half covered by moss and rusted lattice, sitting quietly near the barn's eastern wall. The metal grate had buckled in one corner, and dead leaves had pooled in its mouth like offerings. It shouldn't have meant anything, but it did. Marla stepped closer, her chest tightening. She remembered it not from news reports or old aerial photos, but from a drive she'd taken years ago. Back when she'd been searching every abandoned structure within 20 miles, trespassing and calling her daughter's name into emptiness. She'd driven past this road once, slowed by a flat tire, and she remembered glancing out the window, her eyes briefly catching the curve of a well just beyond the trees. She had been so close. Her knees buckled slightly as she sank down beside it, placing a gloved hand on the cold stones. "Were you here?" she whispered, eyes filling. "Did you cry for me?" The well didn't answer, but something about it, its quiet, its permanence, felt like a witness, a keeper of the truth. She stayed there for a long time. The drawer was in the far corner of the farmhouse kitchen, tucked beneath a half-collapsed counter where rodents had long ago made their home. Most of the cabinets had been emptied during the first sweep-empty beer bottles, mouse droppings, brittle rubber bands, but this drawer had been warped shut, swollen by years of moisture and rot. It took a crowbar and a steady hand to pry it loose without splintering it entirely. Inside was nothing remarkable at first: old receipts, curled into themselves like dying insects, a rusted can opener, and a melted roll of duct tape fused to a spoon. But beneath it all, folded and stuffed between the warped wood and the drawer's edge, was a single photograph. Part of it had burned. The bottom corner was blackened, the edges crisped and curling inward, like someone had held it too close to flame, then changed their mind at the last second, but the faces those were still clear. Detective Brooks held the photo carefully by its edges, her breath catching as she stared. It was Hannah. She looked thinner than in her school photos, older in a way no child should look. Her face was turned slightly from the camera, as if she hadn't known the photo was being taken. Her eyes wide, watchful, seemed to be looking at something beyond the frame. She wore jeans too short at the ankle and a faded red hoodie that didn't look like hers. Beside her stood a boy. Not much older. Maybe 13 or 14. His clothes were wrinkled and mismatched, his dark hair overgrown and falling into his eyes. He wasn't smiling. Neither of them were. Behind them was the unmistakable outline of the farmhouse. The porch, the slanted roof, the broken swing still visible in the background. The photo had been taken from a distance, as though through a window or a long lens. Brooks set the picture down on the evidence table. The boy didn't match any of the known residents of the area. No missing persons alerts on file. But there was something in his expression, tired, guarded, that made her stomach twist. They hadn't just found Hannah. They had found a witness, maybe even a survivor. And someone, at some point, had tried to erase that moment, tried to burn it out of existence. But fire doesn't lie. And photos, even half-destroyed ones, still remember. The name came back from facial recognition 3 days later. It was after midnight, the station mostly quiet except for the hum of vending machines, and the soft clack of Detective Brooks's keyboard as she scrolled through aging case files. When the notification popped onto her screen, she paused, blinking at the name like it had come from a dream she couldn't quite place. Caleb Knox. She whispered it aloud, as if the syllables might summon a memory. The system flagged him as a match with 87% certainty to the boy in the burned photo. Brooks clicked into the file, her heart already tightening. Caleb Knox had vanished 4 counties east in the spring of 2006, just 2 months before Hannah. He was 10 years old, no history of running away, no signs of trouble at home. One afternoon, he left his backyard to follow his dog into the woods. Neither came back. Brooks leaned back in her chair, stunned. She remembered the case now, barely a few old headlines, a picture of a boy in a striped t-shirt and braces, smiling with a kind of crooked innocence. The Knox family hadn't lived near Millhaven. Their cases had never intersected, no one had connected them. Until now. She printed the file and spread it out beside the photo, comparing Caleb's school portrait with the boy next to Hannah. The resemblance was their same jawline, same wary eyes, but it wasn't just the features that matched. It was something deeper, a shared look. The look of children who'd been taken out of the world and placed into something else, something darker. Brooks pulled up the missing persons logs from that year, looking again at the timeline. Caleb in April, Hannah in June. The tapes had begun in 2002, but the label on the burned photo matched the handwriting from tape 44. They'd been there at the same time. Maybe together. She picked up the phone and called the number listed in Caleb's file. It rang 6 times before a woman answered, her voice thin with sleep and age. Caleb's mother. "I know it's late," Brooks said gently, "but I believe your son may still be alive." The line went quiet. Not the silence of disbelief but of something held too long in the chest, a breath that dared not be released. And across town, the boy who no one had seen in 17 years had just become the key to a door no one realized had been left ajar. The entrance had been concealed beneath a false panel of floorboards in the back of the barn, a section of wood that sounded just slightly too hollow when tapped. Its seams lined with decades of dust no bootprint had disturbed. Once lifted, it revealed a narrow staircase that descended into darkness so absolute the flashlight beams felt swallowed by it. The air that rose from below was colder than the rest of the barn still, stagnant and deeply wrong. Detective Brooks stood at the threshold as the forensic team moved in with caution. Her gloved hand rested on the wall beside her, as if to steady herself before descending into a space that had, for years, held secrets no one above had even imagined. The staircase creaked under their weight. At the bottom, they found a chamber barely tall enough to stand in. The walls were concrete, but the floor was packed dirt. No windows, no vent. Just one rusted cot, a metal bucket, and a single dangling light bulb that swayed slightly with their arrival. It wasn't a room made for living. It was made for keeping. Brooke stepped inside, the cold curling around her like a shroud. Her flashlight traced the walls, catching something that made her breath hitch. Words, dozens of them. Carved into the concrete, over and over, some deep, some faint, like they'd been etched in desperation with whatever object had been at hand. I'm here. Tell Mom I'm okay. Don't forget me. A corner of the wall was covered in tally marks, weeks or months of them. A different patch had childish drawing stars, a dog, a small house. And then her name. Hannah. Brooks dropped to one knee and pulled the journal from the evidence bag she'd carried in. She flipped to the pages with Hannah's known entries, comparing the slant of the E's, the curling of the R's. It was her. This room had belonged to her at some point. No, not belonged. She had endured it. A tech called out from across the chamber. "Ma'am, you should see this." He pointed to a square section of wall that looked smoother than the rest. Brooks ran her hand across it and felt an indentation. Letters again, but these were larger. The silence room. Her stomach dropped. The term had been in the journal, a place where screaming wasn't allowed, where children were taught to disappear in pieces, not all at once. Brooks turned slowly, the beam of her flashlight catching on the cot's frame, where something small and glittering had been wedged into the metal slats. A charm, a tiny silver letter H. Hannah had been here, and she had left her name behind like a flare in the dark. The facility sat on the outskirts of another forgotten town, a place where time drifted instead of marched, and patients wandered tiled hallways like ghosts, with soft shoes and blank eyes. It wasn't a prison, but it wasn't freedom either. The intake form listed him as Eli Harper, age 27, admitted at 16 after being found wandering along the highway, emaciated and nonverbal, with no known family, no fingerprints in the system. No one had ever asked the right questions. Until now. Detective Brooks sat across from him in a quiet room padded in pastels. No handcuffs, no mirrors, just a chair, a table, and the man who had once been a boy in a burned photograph beside Hannah Royce. His hair was longer now, curled at the edges, his eyes guarded but sharp. He had the posture of someone used to shrinking, to ducking blows and swallowing noise. But when she said his name, Caleb Knox, something flickered across his face. Not confusion, recognition. It took an hour before he spoke. "I didn't know it was fake," he said finally, voice low and uneven. "The war. He told us there'd been a war, and we were the only ones left." Brooks stayed still. "He said we couldn't go outside because the air was bad, that everyone else had turned violent. We had to stay in the silence room to survive. If we made noise, they'd find us." "Who told you this?" His gaze dropped. "I don't know his real name. He made us call him Mr. Coyle, sometimes just Father." His fingers twisted at the edge of his sleeve. "He said he saved us, that our parents gave us up." Brooks felt her throat tighten. "Did you believe him?" Caleb nodded slowly. "At first. Then Hannah came." "She didn't speak at first either," he said, "just cried in the dark and fed Daisy scraps from her plate. But over time she whispered stories about her real life, her mom, the dog park, the song she hated on the radio. She told him about colors he couldn't remember, the smell of real bread, the sound of a door opening when it wasn't supposed to lock behind you. She helped me remember," he said, "and when she tried to escape, he punished her." His voice cracked, but he didn't look away. Brooks waited, but he didn't continue. "What did he do, Caleb?" "She screamed," he said, eyes distant. "Just once." Then came the silence, the kind that didn't end. The chalk had faded, but it hadn't disappeared. It was found behind a false panel in the cellar wall loosened when one of the forensic team leaned too hard against the stone. The slab gave way with a hollow pop, revealing another cavity, narrow and dark, like a secret drawer carved from concrete. Inside, the air was colder, as if untouched by breath for years. Detective Brooks knelt first, flashlight beam steady as she peered inside. The writing started low, near the dirt floor, and climbed in uneven columns toward the ceiling. Names. First names, mostly, some full, each followed by a date month, year scratched in faint white chalk or scrawled in pencil. The writing varied, as if written by different hands, over time. Children's hands, mostly. She read them aloud, one by one. Lena, April 2003. Joey, October 2004. Micah, June 2005. Her voice trailed off. There were 17 names. 6 were crossed out. A single line, sometimes 2, dragged across each name with aggressive force, as if erasing wasn't enough, they had to be buried. A forensic analyst leaned over her shoulder. These names, some of them match. Brooks turned. Match what? He pulled a tablet from his pack, scrolling through a PDF. The National Missing Children's Registry. Look, Joey Marston, vanished from a campsite in Idaho, 2004. Lena Westcott, taken from a playground in Kansas, 2003. These aren't local kids, they're from all over. Brooks stared back at the wall. The handwriting varied, yes, but the pattern was consistent. The first few names had been carved with space between them. By the end, they were stacked tightly, letters crammed against one another, as if there was no more room left to hide them. Like someone hadn't expected to need that much space, and then suddenly did. And at the very bottom, in thinner, more delicate script, a final name. Hannah. June 2006. No line crossed through it. Beside it, a small symbol, 2 hearts drawn together, overlapping at the center. Brooks recognized it. It had appeared once, scribbled in the corner of the journal. She reached out, her fingers hovering just over the wall. Who wrote these? She whispered. Caleb, probably. Or maybe one of the others. Brooks stared at the crossed-out names. Or maybe he did. Because some of these children hadn't been found. Some never would be. And in this silent tomb of names, the walls weren't just keeping secrets. They were counting. The town didn't want to believe it. Millhaven had always been the kind of place where faces were familiar and reputations stuck like gum on the bottom of a church pew. People remembered birthdays, dropped off casseroles when someone got sick, waved from their driveways like it meant something, and no one had waved more oftener, smiled more brightly than Raymond Giles. He'd been a fixture of the town for decades, former school board president, volunteer firefighter, Sunday school teacher. He hosted the 4th of July picnic every year on his sprawling lakeside property, his hand always firm on your shoulder, his voice warm with just the right mix of concern and charm. So when his name surfaced quietly, at first there was a ripple of denial, not fear. A mistake, surely, some kind of clerical confusion. But it wasn't a mistake. Detective Brooks stood over a thick file on her desk, her jaw clenched, the room lit by a single desk lamp and the dull red pulse of the answering machine. Inside the file were decades of connections. Raymond Giles had been one of the private donors who helped fund Hillview Home for Children. He'd served on the Oversight Committee unofficial, off the books, the kind that met in diners and church basements. He'd also owned the Farmhouse. Not directly. The deed had been transferred through a shell corporation in 2001, just a year after Daniel Coyle's foster home came under scrutiny and quietly shut its doors. The trail had been buried old names, burned paperwork, P.O. boxes with no forwarding addresses. Until now. One of the VHS tapes, recovered from the freezer, had Giles's voice on it. Just once. A single line, heard off-camera during a clip from 2005. The video was of the barn, a cot visible, a child's thin legs dangling over the edge. And then the voice. Close the door. Don't let them see her cry. Brooks played it over and over again. The waveform burned into her skull. She hadn't told the press. Not yet. Not until they had him in custody. But it was coming. And she knew what it would do to the town. To the people who had trusted him, who had elected him, welcomed him into their homes, let him sign checks for playground repairs and read bedtime stories at the library. The worst monsters weren't the ones in shadows. They were the ones who smiled while they locked the door. The house no longer whispered, it groaned. Every creak of the boards and sigh of wind through broken windows had once been part of the silence, part of the fear that kept children from running, from yelling, from dreaming. But now, the walls spoke in memories, in fragments. Detective Brooks sat across from Caleb again, this time not in the sterile meeting room of the institution, but in a safe house tucked outside the city. The lighting was soft, the questions were harder. She knew, he said, eyes distant. She knew it wasn't going to end well. He spoke slowly, like dragging pieces from a locked box in his mind. She was the first to fight. The rest of us, we just tried to survive. But Shesh talked back, asked questions, planned things. His voice cracked. She said she didn't want to die in a hole. Brooks waited. Hannah tried to escape 3 times. The first time she made it to the edge of the woods. She almost got out, but he caught her. And after that, she was never allowed above ground again. His hands twisted in his lap. He put her in the silence room. What happened to her after that? Brooks asked gently. Caleb didn't answer at first. When he spoke again, his voice had gone thin. She stopped talking, not because he told her to, because she was afraid that if she said the wrong thing, someone else would pay for it, me, or the others. Did she ever say anything to you after that? One night, he said, she gave me something, said to hide it. If anything happened, I had to remember where it was. Brooks leaned in. What was it? He hesitated. A key. Small, rusted. She said it opened a box. She didn't say what was inside, just, it's my voice. If I can't speak, maybe this can. They brought Caleb back to the farmhouse 2 days later. He didn't go inside, he couldn't. But he stood in the barn doorway and pointed to a loose plank beneath the cot where Hannah had been kept. Underneath, they found a tin box wrapped in fabric. Inside were pages, folded notes. One was addressed simply, "If someone is reading this, I didn't get out." She had written everything. Names, details, what he looked like, what he said. And on the last page, a single line. "My name is Hannah Royce. Please don't forget me." No one would now. The creek bed had dried into a ribbon of cracked earth and tangled roots, a hollowed scar behind the barn where water hadn't flowed in years. Ivy crept through the stones like veins, and old branches littered the banks as if nature itself had tried to cover something it couldn't forget. They found her at dawn. A cadaver dog, brought in to sweep the perimeter one final time, stopped abruptly near a cluster of willow branches that had bent low over the ground. The dog sat, tail still, ears high. The handler didn't speak, just raised a hand. Detective Brooks arrived minutes later, boots sinking slightly into the soft mud as she approached. The forensic team had already begun clearing the brush. What had first looked like a pile of animal bones now revealed something smaller, straighter, human. She crouched low, her heart in her throat. It was a shallow grave. Not careless, but not deep enough to keep secrets forever. The soil had shifted over the years, washing thin with every rainstorm. Roots had broken through the surface. Time had tried to uncover her. The first thing they found was a scrap of red fabric, clinging to the remains like it still wanted to be a hoodie. Beside it, a tiny collar, rusted and broken, still faintly etched with a single word, Daisy. The dog had been buried with her. Their bones intertwined, the way they must have curled together in life, finding warmth in the cold silence of that place. Daisy's skull rested just beneath Hannah's ribcage, like she'd crawled into her in those final moments, as if to protect her, even when no one else did. Brooks stood slowly, her throat tight, her jaw clenched against something dangerously close to grief. The coroner worked quietly, respectfully. No one said Hannah's name aloud. It hung there, heavy and sacred, as the forensic team uncovered what was left of a child who'd been loved, who'd laughed in sunlit kitchens, who'd vanished on a walk with her dog 17 years ago and had never been seen again. Until now. Brooks looked toward the barn, its frame silhouetted in the rising light. For all its shadows and secrets, it had failed to bury the truth. The girl who had once carved her name into a wall hadn't been lost. She had just been waiting to be found. He was dying, and he knew it. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee, with the kind of thin curtains that did nothing to keep out the world. George Conway lay in the bed, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rattling breaths. He was the younger brother of former Sheriff Nolan Conway, a name once spoken with reverence in Millhaven. A man believed to be incorruptible, the kind of sheriff who shook hands in diners and prayed at football games. But now, all that remained of the Conway name was a man with IVs in his arm and something heavy pressing against his ribs that wasn't just the tumor. Detective Brooks sat beside the bed, recorder ticking softly on the tray table between them. She didn't have to press him. George had asked for her, said he had something to say before he went. "I knew about the farmhouse," he rasped, voice paper thin. "I knew what my brother was doing. Or, at least, what he was letting happen." Brooks didn't move, didn't speak. "He told me it was just a place to move kids who had nowhere else to go. Said the system was broken. That it was better than leaving them on the street." George turned his head slowly toward the window, eyes clouded with memory. "But I saw things. I went out there once, 2005 maybe. There was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 10. She had blood on her knees, wouldn't look at me. I asked Nolan who she was, and he said, 'Don't ask questions you don't want answers to.'" Brooks felt something stir at the base of her spine, cold and familiar. "He told me to keep my mouth shut, that if I loved this town, if I loved him, I'd let it be." "You did more than let it be," she said, voice low. George nodded, a tear slipping from the corner of his eye. "I burned the records, helped move one of the boys after things got too risky. I even delivered groceries once a month. I saw Hannah there. He broke off, voice shaking. "I'm sorry. I thought I was protecting people." "You protected monsters," Brooks said, not unkindly. He closed his eyes. "I know." Outside, the sky was a bleak, washed-out gray. Brooks turned off the recorder, the weight of the confession settling like ash over her shoulders. The truth had come too late to stop what happened. But not too late to bury it properly. The church overflowed. People lined the pews shoulder to shoulder, some standing along the back walls, others gathered outside beneath umbrellas, listening through speakers that had been set up at the last minute. The sky was gray, but it didn't rain, just threatened to, like the sky itself was holding its breath. 17 years after Hannah Royce vanished, they were finally laying her to rest. The casket was small, ashwood, simple, adorned with a spray of white lilies and one red ribbon tied in a bow just like the kind Hannah used to wear in her hair. It sat at the front of the altar, surrounded by photographs that spanned her short life. Hannah riding her bike, Hannah in her school play, Hannah with Daisy curled beside her on the living room rug. Moments that now felt too fragile to look at for long. Marla stood beside Greg, her hands clenched around a folded piece of paper. She had written and rewritten the eulogy so many times she couldn't remember what version she'd finally chosen. But when she stepped forward and faced the room, she didn't read from the paper. She didn't need to. "My daughter was brave," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "She was kind. She was trusting in a world that didn't deserve it. And for a long time, I was afraid she'd be remembered only for what happened to her, for the day she disappeared." She looked down at the casket. But she was so much more than that. She was sunlight and noise and stubbornness and wonder, and even in the darkest place, she left a light behind. Outside, the bells rang. News crews stood at a respectful distance, lenses lowered. The story had gone national weeks, Aga first the collar, then the tapes, the grave, the names on the wall. It had broken something open. Other families came forward. Other missing children's cases were pulled from dusty archives. There was outrage, mourning, demands for reform. A reckoning that echoed far beyond Millhaven's borders. But inside that church, there was only one name that mattered. When the service ended, the procession moved slowly down the hill to the cemetery. Hannah's casket was lowered into the earth beside Daisy's, their resting place marked by a single stone etched with both their names. Marla knelt by the grave, her hand resting on the soil. She didn't cry. Not because she wasn't broken, but because after 17 years of silence, her daughter had finally been heard. The bench was new, though it had been built to look old weathered wood sealed against the rain, iron arms that curved like branches. It stood in the same spot it always had, just off the trail behind the Royce property, facing the path that disappeared into the trees. The original bench had rotted away years ago, left untouched out of respect until time had taken it back. Now, it had been rebuilt, restored. Marla sat on it as she had so many times before, a wool shawl pulled tight around her shoulders despite the warmth in the late spring air. In her hands, she held the faded pink collar, its brass tag worn smooth from time and touch. Daisy, it still read, barely. Her fingers moved over the letters slowly, like she was reading them for the first time. It had been 17 years since Hannah had vanished, 17 years of absence that had carved silence into every part of their home. But now, silence felt different. Not empty. Not cruel. Just still. There were flowers planted beneath the bench-white daisies, of course, and beside them, a small plaque that read, "For Hannah and Daisy, you found your way home." The world had changed. The farmhouse had been razed. The land would be left to the trees, nothing rebuilt, no marker except the memory of what had been uncovered there. Caleb Knox had testified, then disappeared quietly into witness protection, his new name known only to a few. His words had helped bring justice not just for Hannah, but for others whose names had once been scrawled in chalk on concrete walls. And Marla had changed too. Grief didn't vanish, but it no longer defined her. She had found something steadier in its place. Not peace maybe, but understanding. She thought about that last discovery, the tin box beneath the cot, wrapped in fabric, tucked away where only someone who'd loved her might find it. Hannah had known what was happening. She had known someone needed to remember. She had been trying to protect Caleb. A boy just like her, another child caught in the dark. Marla looked down the trail, the afternoon sun casting soft shadows through the canopy. She didn't expect anyone to come. But she stayed, Daisy's collar cradled in her hands, letting the quiet settle around her like an old friend. She finally knew where her daughter rested. And she finally knew who she had been. Not just a girl who vanished. A girl who tried to save someone else.